Dawn crawled over the Solomon Islands, painting the sky in pale light as a lone Marine Corps F4F Wildcat lifted from the humid runway. Above him, Japanese pilots circled with practiced confidence, certain his outdated machine stood no chance against their faster, lighter Zeros. But within minutes, the quiet morning would erupt into a storm none of them expected. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps this history reach more people. In early 1942, the Pacific War was entering a phase that few American planners had truly anticipated. The Japanese advance had been relentless, sweeping through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with a speed that stunned even seasoned officers. Their pilots dominated the skies with frightening precision, flying aircraft that many Americans had never seen before the war. And among these new machines, none was feared more than the Mitsubishi A6M0. Lightweight, agile, and possessing an extraordinary turn radius, the Zero quickly earned a reputation for absolute aerial superiority. To American aircrews stationed across scattered island bases, it seemed as if the Zero could appear from nowhere, twist inside any attack angle, and shred formations before they realized they were being hunted. Newspapers back home exaggerated its abilities even further, painting it as a near-mythical machine, faster, deadlier, almost unbeatable. In contrast stood the U.S. Marine Corps' primary fighter, the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Compared to the Zero, the Wildcat was heavier, slower, and outwardly unimpressive. Its rugged, boxy frame looked outdated even in 1942. Some American pilots joked that it felt like flying a steel bathtub, and Japanese aviators, confident in their aircraft's sleek superiority, openly mocked it in captured diaries and after-action notes. They described it as clunky, primitive, and unworthy of respect. Yet beneath that unglamorous skin, the Wildcat carried qualities that would soon change air combat over the Pacific. Its armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and sturdy construction meant it could endure punishment that would shatter the lighter, lightly protected Zero. What it lacked in acrobatic agility, it compensated for with durability, stability in high-speed dives, and a set of .50 caliber Browning machine guns capable of tearing apart even the toughest bomber fuselage. Still, in early 1942, reputation meant everything, and the reputation of the American fighter arm was grim. At bases like Henderson Field and outposts across the Solomons, aircrews struggled to maintain aircraft under brutal heat, constant rain, and supply shortages. Runways were little more than packed dirt. Spare parts arrived sporadically, often scavenged from wrecks or shipped in crates that took weeks to reach the front. Pilots flew long hours, slept little, and lived with the knowledge that any scramble could be their last. The Japanese, meanwhile, presented a picture of disciplined momentum. Their pilots were experienced, many having fought in China for years before Pearl Harbor. They practiced tight formation flying, aggressive attack runs, and coordinated bomber escort tactics, methods that overwhelmed poorly prepared defenses. The American approach, still evolving, leaned heavily on improvisation and adaptation. Marine and Navy pilots learned hard lessons with every sortie: never try to outturn a Zero, never become trapped on its horizontal plane, always keep speed and altitude as advantages. Slowly, they forged their own counter-tactics, especially the lethal boom and zoom dive attacks that used gravity and engine strength to strike quickly before the Zero could retaliate. It was within this tense environment that one Marine pilot, like many others whose names faded into the haze of history, operated. He had flown the Wildcat long before its reputation changed, long before pilots discovered its hidden strengths. To him, the aircraft was not outdated, it was simply the tool he had, and mastering it meant survival. Stationed on a humid, mosquito-choked airstrip carved out of jungle terrain, he flew missions that blended exhaustion with constant alertness. Each day began before sunrise, checking fuel lines for condensation, examining ammunition belts for corrosion, and wiping salt residue from canopy rails. Marines on the ground joked that the aircraft aged faster than the pilots. But even with all its flaws, the Wildcat remained dependable. It absorbed hits that would down a Zero instantly. It brought pilots home with shot-up wings, leaking hydraulics, or bullet holes stitched across the fuselage. And every time it returned to the runway, the maintenance crews worked through the night to coax it into one more flight. By February 1942, Japanese forces intensified their raids on American positions across the Solomons. Their bombers came in tight formations, escorted by confident Zero pilots who viewed the local Marine flyers as inexperienced opponents in inferior machines. They circled above American airfields with an air of easy dominance, certain that no Wildcat could challenge them. But radar stations, new, fragile, and still experimental, were beginning to reshape the battlefield. Early warning systems detected incoming raids long before aircraft appeared visually. Pilots no longer scrambled blindly, they ascended with purpose, with intercept vectors, with coordinated timing. And on one particular morning, as the system picked up a large formation heading straight toward their sector, the pilot climbed into his Wildcat with the same calm ritual he practiced every day. He didn't yet know that he was flying toward the moment that would redefine how the Japanese viewed the outdated American fighter. He only knew that another fight was coming. By the time the sun lifted higher over the Solomons, the humidity had already begun to settle like a warm fog over the airstrip. The Marine pilot tightened the chinstrap of his leather flight helmet, feeling the weight of another long day setting in. He wasn't a legendary ace or a widely celebrated figure, just one of dozens of young Americans thrown into a war that grew more unpredictable by the hour. Yet he carried with him something far more valuable than reputation, experience carved from months of exhaustion, loss, and adaptation. His squadron operated from a makeshift base supported by improvised repair sheds, refueling pits, and open-air workshops where mechanics worked under tarps during tropical downpours. Supplies arrived unevenly. Ammunition shipments sometimes came without spare parts, other times, parts arrived with no fuel to make the next sortie. It was a theater defined by improvisation, a constant trial where readiness hinged on teamwork and resourcefulness, not perfection. The pilot's Wildcat had flown through more missions than its original designers had likely imagined. Its paint was faded from sun exposure, its fuselage patched in 3 places from previous engagements. But the engine still roared with the same stubborn reliability that made the Wildcat a machine American pilots gradually learned to trust with their lives. Whenever he ran a glove across the cowling, he could feel the roughness of replaced panels alongside factory-smooth metal. Each mark told a story. A burst of machine gun fire survived, a dive pulled out just in time, a return flight completed against the odds. His training had begun before the war, when the Marine Corps was still refining its aviation doctrine. He learned gunnery principles, deflection shooting, burst discipline, target tracking, under instructors who had flown in exercises rather than combat. Back then, no one fully understood the kind of enemy they would soon face. Real combat experience, once rare, became the daily teacher as the Pacific conflict escalated. To the Japanese pilots now pouring into the Solomon Islands theater, American aviators appeared inexperienced and outmatched. They had flown in China, mastered aerial duels, and sharpened their confidence through years of near-unbroken success. Many Zero pilots arrived believing that American aircraft were crudely engineered machines constructed by a nation that favored durability over finesse. Their mindset was shaped by early victories, a dangerous mixture of pride and underestimation. Operational intelligence confirmed these attitudes. Captured notes from downed Japanese aviators spoke casually of the Wildcat as slow, clumsy, and no threat individually. Some even wrote that American pilots climbed like stones compared to the Zero. This overconfidence contributed to rigid Japanese tactics, predictable escort patterns, assumptions about American breakaways, and a reluctance to adjust their dogfighting methods when facing new challenges. On the American side, technological and tactical improvements slowly shifted the balance. The introduction of radar gave defenders precious minutes of warning. Plotting boards in operations huts displayed positions of incoming aircraft long before anyone could hear engines. Spotters, often Marines stationed with binoculars along the jungle line, corroborated the radar signals, providing visual confirmation as formations closed. With every alarm, pilots raced for their aircraft. Engines sputtered to life under the strain of humidity and rushed maintenance. Ground crews stood ready with wheel chocks, fuel lines, and ammunition belts as the pilots ran through their checks. These men operated as a single unit, each action precise, each role critical. They had learned painfully that any small delay could cost lives. On the morning of the event that would define the Marine pilot's legacy, the radar screen inside the cramped operations shack flickered with an unmistakable pattern, a dense cluster approaching from the northwest. The formation appeared large, likely a strike group of Japanese bombers with Zero escorts. The range began to close, numbers stabilizing as operators refined their readings. Inside the hut, tension grew. Officers exchanged measured glances. They had seen this pattern before, raids intended to cripple the airstrip, cut supply lines, and break American resistance. But something was different today. The size of the formation was larger than usual, suggesting a determined attack meant to crush the battered Marine forces stationed here. Runners dashed across the airstrip, relaying orders to the ready pilots. Mechanics made final adjustments to the Wildcats. Fuel caps tightened, ammunition trays locked in place, oil lines checked for leaks. The air became thick with the smell of gasoline, hot metal, and wet earth. The pilot slid into his cockpit, securing straps and adjusting the small photograph tucked beside the instrument panel, a reminder of home, perhaps, or simply a ritual of comfort before facing another battle. His hands moved with practiced precision over the controls. He had done this countless times, but today carried a weight he could feel in his chest. The order crackled over the field: scramble. Intercept inbound formation. Altitude priority. Engines roared to life across the runway. The pilot advanced his throttle gently to avoid engine flooding, then more assertively as the propeller blades blurred into motion. The Wildcat lurched forward, bumping across the uneven runway, throwing dust behind it. He lifted off, climbing toward the sunlit sky as ground crews and operations staff watched from below. Every ascent like this held uncertainty, yet this morning felt sharper, charged with the unmistakable tension of an engagement that could alter the momentum of the entire area. And as the Wildcat climbed into the rising heat of the upper air, the Japanese formation came into view, dark specks growing larger, flying in confident alignment. They believed they knew exactly what awaited them: slow American fighters, poorly coordinated, easy to swat down. But they had not yet met the pilot climbing to intercept them. The battle that morning would not be decided by a single factor. It would be shaped by a mix of technology, human endurance, and enemy misjudgment, elements that converged in ways neither side fully anticipated. To understand why this engagement unfolded as it did, each angle must be viewed on its own terms, revealing the unseen forces that influenced every maneuver, every burst of gunfire, and every choice in the sky. Angle 1, Technological Angle, the Wildcat versus the Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was an engineering triumph of its era, light, agile, and unmatched in its low-speed turn performance. Japanese designers achieved this by stripping weight wherever possible: thin skin panels, minimal armor, and no self-sealing fuel tanks. The result was a fighter that danced through the air with extraordinary grace, but one that shattered easily under fire. The American Wildcat, by comparison, was the opposite approach taken to its extreme. Heavier, sturdier, and built for survivability, it was designed to bring its pilot home, even when badly damaged. Its structure absorbed punishment the Zero simply could not withstand. While slower in the climb and less nimble in a turning fight, the Wildcat held a decisive advantage in dives. Its robust airframe tolerated high speeds without losing control, giving American pilots the perfect tool for boom and zoom tactics. This technological contrast shaped every engagement in the Pacific. Japanese pilots believed the Wildcat was inferior because it could not match the Zero's elegant maneuvers. What they failed to understand was that the American fighter was never meant to. Its strengths lay in its resilience, its firepower, and its ability to exploit gravity, not finesse. On that morning over the Solomons, these differences would determine who lived and who did not. Angle 2, Human Angle, the pilot's endurance and experience. Months of combat had reshaped the Marine pilot into something far tougher than the men who had arrived early in the war. He had learned the hard way that fear was not something to eliminate but something to manage. Every sortie carried the same uncertainty: engines could fail, strafing runs could go wrong, a momentary lapse could leave him defenseless. Yet he flew with the quiet resilience that comes only from survival over time. He understood the Wildcat's limits because he had felt them personally. He knew when the controls stiffened in a climb, when the engine ran hot, when the airframe began to vibrate during a steep dive. He could read the machine's behavior with instinctive clarity. This experience allowed him to perform maneuvers newer pilots hesitated to attempt. He had also learned not to be intimidated by the Zero's reputation. In earlier missions, he had witnessed American trainees panic at the sight of the sleek, pale gray fighters slicing toward them. Some attempted to outturn the Zero, a decision that ended with predictable tragedy. But this pilot had survived enough encounters to understand the truth: fear favored the enemy. Precision favored survival. And so, despite the fatigue carved into his muscles and the weight of months spent living on edge, he climbed that morning with the calm focus of a man who knew exactly what he had to do. Angle 3, Enemy Angle, Japanese overconfidence and cultural mindset. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized aggression, precision, and absolute faith in aircraft superiority. Zero pilots were trained to believe they were unmatched in skill and machine, and early victories reinforced this belief. They assumed the slow American fighters were simply targets delaying the inevitable expansion of Japanese control. Captured reports described American aircraft as unrefined, overweight, and unable to defend themselves at altitude. Many Japanese aviators treated combat against Wildcats as little more than target practice. They expected panicked evasions, broken formations, and predictable defensive turns. But this overconfidence came at a cost. It prevented adaptation. It caused escorts to underestimate American climb speeds. It made pilots predictable in their approach angles and too eager to assume an advantage where there was none. On this morning, the formation approaching the Marine airspace held the same mindset. The Zero pilots swept forward with casual assurance, assuming that the American fighters scrambling below had no realistic chance of stopping them. What they could not see, what they could not yet imagine, was how quickly their assumptions would collapse. And as the Wildcat closed the distance toward the inbound formation, the battle's true turning point began to take shape. The engagement that was moments away would not be shaped solely by machines or mindsets. It would be molded by choices, split-second decisions influenced by leadership, tactics, and even the natural world. To see how the Marine pilot overturned the assumptions of an entire Japanese formation, the remaining angles must be understood together. Angle 4, Tactical Angle, Boom and Zoom versus Turning Combat. American pilots who survived the early months of the Pacific Air War learned one critical truth: a Wildcat that tried to turn with a Zero was already dead. The Zero could pivot inside its opponent's radius within seconds, lock into firing position, and deliver rounds with devastating accuracy. The Wildcat had no chance in that arena. But what it lacked in agility, it made up for in raw diving power. The Wildcat's rugged wings and reinforced structure allowed it to withstand high-speed dives that would tear a Zero apart. And in those dives, the American fighter gained something the enemy had not planned for: an energy advantage. The Marine pilot understood this perfectly. His entire strategy revolved around altitude control and aggressive vertical maneuvering. If he stayed above the formation, he controlled the engagement. If he maintained speed, he remained untouchable. By diving into an attack, firing a burst, and then climbing back into the sky, he forced the Zero pilots into a losing game. They could not follow him into steep dives without risking structural failure. They could not climb after him without bleeding away precious speed. This was the core of the American boom and zoom doctrine. It transformed the Wildcat from a supposedly outdated machine into a weapon that could decide the tempo of combat. And on this morning, the pilot intended to use every ounce of that advantage. Angle 5, Leadership Angle, Command Decisions and Airgroup Coordination. No pilot, no matter how skilled, operated alone. Behind every launch was a chain of decisions made by officers, radar operators, and squadron leaders who interpreted signals and committed men to the sky. That morning, leadership played a quiet but decisive role. Inside the cramped command hut, the operations officer reviewed radar plots that grew denser with each passing minute. He recognized the attack pattern. It mirrored previous Japanese bomber pushes but on a much larger scale. He ordered the pilots to prioritize altitude, not interception distance. It was a risky choice. Climbing consumed fuel and reduced flight time over the battle area. But altitude equaled survival. Altitude equaled opportunity. The commanding officer trusted his pilots to execute without hesitation. He had watched them adapt and evolve through months of attrition. He knew who among them excelled in the vertical fight, who remained calm under pressure, and who understood the Wildcat's true strengths. The Marine pilot launching into the morning sky was one of the few who consistently demonstrated that blend of tactical discipline and instinct. Leadership decisions extended beyond the cockpit. Ground crews, despite fatigue and scarce resources, ensured the Wildcats were loaded, fueled, and armed with absolute precision. Every belt of ammunition fed cleanly, every fuel line secured without leaks. Even the placement of aircraft along the runway reflected careful planning, spacing that allowed rapid launches without collision risk. The coordination of these efforts formed the backbone of the squadron's performance. Without this support, no amount of individual skill could have turned the impending engagement. Angle 6, Environmental Angle, Dawn Light, Cloud Layers, and Pacific Weather. The Solomon Islands battlefield was shaped not only by machines and doctrine but by the very air through which pilots flew. The region's early mornings brought shifting winds, rising humidity, and layered cloud formations that obscured vision and warped sound. This particular morning offered conditions that the Marine pilot recognized instantly: a thin blanket of low fog hugging the coastline, mid-altitude clouds drifting in from the west, and a narrow band of clear air at higher altitude. These environmental layers created natural cover, opportunities for concealment, surprise, and escape. The Japanese formation approached with the rising sun behind them. To most observers, this seemed like an advantage, but the pilot knew the truth. Sunlight also silhouetted the attackers, making them visible earlier than they expected. Their tight formation, while impressive, also made them a larger target. The Marine pilot climbed through the first cloud bank, leveling into a pocket of clear air just as the Japanese formation emerged from the glare. For a brief moment, he hovered unseen above 12 bombers flying with mechanical precision. The Zeros, positioned slightly ahead and above, focused forward, unaware that an American fighter had slipped into the upper atmosphere with a perfect attack window. Environmental factors, sun angle, cloud openings, and early morning airflow, combined to create a moment of tactical perfection. And the pilot, trained by months of experience and sharpened instincts, recognized this opening as soon as it appeared. He tightened his grip on the control stick, aligned his dive angle, and prepared for the attack that would change everything. The Marine pilot steadied his breathing as he reached the upper edge of the cloud layer. Below him, the Japanese formation pressed steadily toward its target, 12 bombers in a staggered V, their engines droning in rhythmic harmony, guarded by Zeros flying with the confidence of men who believed no American fighter would dare challenge them. The morning sun painted the bombers' aluminum skins with a faint glow, making them visible through the mist like shadows rising from the ocean surface. From his vantage point, the pilot could see the structure of the formation clearly. The bombers were Mitsubishi G4M Bettys, notorious for their long range and destructive payloads but equally infamous for their vulnerability to heavy gunfire. Their fuel tanks were not self-sealing, even small-caliber rounds could turn them into airborne fireballs. The Wildcat's .50 caliber guns were built for such targets, and the pilot knew exactly where to strike. He leveled off briefly, adjusting his trim, ensuring his wings were stable. Diving required precision. Deviating even slightly could turn a clean pass into a wasted burst or worse, an overshoot that exposed him to zero counterattack. His training taught him to treat each approach like a mathematical problem: angle, distance, speed, time to target. The Wildcat thrummed beneath him, its engine humming with the familiar low growl that signaled readiness. Below, the escorting Zeros scanned the skies ahead but not above. Overconfidence blinded them. They expected the Americans to climb desperately from lower altitude, not to appear like a silent predator descending from the heavens. It was an assumption that would cost them dearly. With a final glance at his airspeed indicator, the pilot pushed the nose forward. The Wildcat dropped like a stone, gravity pulling it into a steep dive. The wind roared across the fuselage, vibrating the canopy glass and rattling the pilot's harness straps. He felt the familiar pressure building across his chest as the speedometer needle surged. The bomber formation grew rapidly in his sights, first distant shapes, then detailed silhouettes, then clear targets. He had one chance at the perfect opening strike. Aligning his gun sight with the lead bomber's left engine housing, he waited for the exact moment when distance and closure rate converged. Then, with a short, disciplined squeeze, he unleashed a concentrated burst of .50 caliber fire. Tracers tore through the morning air, slamming into the Betty's engine cowling. A bloom of flame erupted instantly. The bomber lurched sideways, wobbling violently as smoke billowed from its wing. Within seconds, the aircraft tipped into a fatal descent, breaking formation as the crew scrambled inside the burning fuselage. The pilot did not watch it crash. He rolled slightly, adjusting his dive toward the bomber just behind the first. The Japanese formation staggered, bombers shifting erratically as pilots reacted to the sudden attack. The escorts began to peel off their positions, searching frantically for the American fighter they could not yet see. He fired again. Another controlled burst. More tracers. The second bomber's glass nose shattered under the impact, sparks flaring along its fuselage. The aircraft dipped sharply, losing cohesion before its right engine caught fire. A trail of black smoke marked its path as it veered out of formation. 2 bombers down in seconds. Still diving, he cut across the formation's flank, using the Wildcat's acceleration to reposition. The bombers struggled to regroup, their formation collapsing under the shock of the attack. The Zeros finally spotted the descending Wildcat, but they were too low, too far forward, too late to intercept his initial run. The pilot aimed for a third bomber, this one flying slightly higher than the rest. He fired a short burst at the wing root. The bullets struck with a precision born from endless practice. The bomber shuddered, then one of its wing sections split open. The aircraft rolled uncontrollably, beginning a slow spiral downward. Crewmen inside could be seen scrambling in panic, but there was no saving the machine. That made 3. But the dive had taken him dangerously low, close enough that the Zeros could now engage. His altitude advantage was gone. He had seconds to react. The pilot leveled out sharply, pulling the Wildcat into a shallow arc and pouring power into his engine. The Zero pilots, jolted from their earlier calm, dove aggressively to cut him off. 3 fighters peeled toward him, their angled wings slicing clean lines through the air. They fired sporadically, their rounds streaking past his fuselage. But the pilot knew something they did not: the Wildcat outperformed the Zero in high-speed horizontal flight. As long as he did not turn sharply or bleed speed, he could outrun their initial pursuit. He maintained his throttle, climbed slightly through a bank of low cloud, and broke visual contact. For a moment, the sky fell silent, only engine hum and wind noise filling the cockpit. Then he broke the cloud's upper edge and saw the bomber formation once more, now missing 3 aircraft and struggling to maintain cohesion. The Zeros were scattered below, spread thin in their attempt to locate him. The pilot knew exactly what that meant. He still owned the high ground. He pushed the Wildcat into another climbing arc, preparing for a second dive, one that would exploit the chaos forming below. The bombers had lost their rhythm. The escorts had lost their discipline. And he still had ammunition. The moment was shifting decisively, and the next attack would turn a surprise strike into a complete collapse of the Japanese formation. The Marine pilot steadied his climb, rising once more above the fractured Japanese formation. Every second he regained altitude was a second the enemy could not afford to lose. Below him, the bombers struggled to realign, their once tight V-shaped precision reduced to scattered clusters. The Zeros, shaken from their earlier certainty, darted across the sky with increasing urgency, their disciplined escort pattern replaced by frantic searching arcs. They had expected a simple mission, an easy strike against an American airfield. Instead, they had walked into a layered, vertical battlefield they did not control. At the top of his climb, the pilot leveled out, taking a moment to assess. The sun now hung higher, illuminating the drifting clouds and scattered aircraft below. Smoke from the 3 destroyed bombers trailed toward the sea like dark ribbons. The remaining 9 pressed onward, trying desperately to maintain altitude and direction. They were vulnerable, slow, exposed, and suddenly unsupported. It was time. He nosed the Wildcat downward again, feeling the familiar acceleration as gravity pulled him into the attack. The cockpit vibrated as air pressure built around the fuselage. The horizon tilted. The enemy formation grew larger with every second. Ahead of him, 2 Zeros attempted to climb and intercept, but their ascent was too steep. They lacked the energy advantage he now possessed. He passed them in a blur, too fast for them to adjust. His gunsight centered on the next bomber. He selected a target on the outer left of the group, a Betty struggling to keep formation after the chaos of the first attack. He knew its weakness: a Wildcat's burst to the wing root or cockpit area could cripple the aircraft in seconds. He squeezed the trigger. A concentrated stream of .50 caliber fire ripped through the bomber's forward fuselage. Glass shattered. Metal peeled back under the impact. A brief orange flash erupted from the nose as the cockpit filled with smoke. The aircraft pitched downward immediately, losing altitude so rapidly that its escorts could not react. 4. Without hesitating, he adjusted his position, sliding across the formation's flank and angling upward just enough to convert speed into a shallow zoom climb. Enemy tracers flicked past from a tail gunner, but the Wildcat's armor absorbed the glancing hits. He banked sharply, rolled inverted, and cut back down toward another bomber still attempting to stay on course. He fired a quick burst at its left engine. The impact ignited the fuel inside. Flames poured out in a thick spiral. The crew inside fought to stabilize the aircraft, but the fire consumed the wing almost instantly. The bomber listed violently to one side, then began a wide, uncontrollable fall toward the ocean. 5. The remaining Japanese pilots began to grasp the scale of the disaster. Their formation, so carefully organized minutes earlier, was now collapsing under the weight of a single Wildcat's relentless vertical attacks. The escorts, recognizing too late that altitude was the true battleground, scrambled upward in steep climbs that left them exposed. The pilot seized the opportunity. He arced into a long loop that brought him behind and above 3 more bombers flying in a loose triangle. Their defensive gunners opened fire in a panic, sending scattered tracers upward, but their aim was erratic. At this angle, their defensive arcs were useless. He lined up the closest target, a bomber trailing slightly behind the others, and released a controlled burst. Rounds smashed into the fuselage, tearing through the fuel tanks. A bright flash signaled the explosion. The blast engulfed the aircraft instantly, its wing detaching in a violent spray of debris. 6. He had remaining ammunition, but not enough to waste. The pilot shifted his angle slightly and dove toward a second bomber whose tail gunner was firing desperately in wide, uncontrolled arcs. He approached from below, avoiding the gunner's natural field of fire. Then he pulled upward sharply, firing into the belly of the aircraft. The impact shattered the internal structure. The bomber broke into 2 burning halves before spiraling downward. 7. But now the Zeros were closing in. A pair of fighters swept toward him from opposite directions, aiming to trap him between converging attack angles. Their plan was textbook ambush: force him into a turn he could not win, or push him into a stall. The pilot recognized the danger instantly. Instead of committing to evasive turns, he pulled the Wildcat into a sudden vertical climb, a maneuver the Zero could not follow without losing speed. The Zeros chased upward for a brief moment, climbed too steeply, then stalled. The pilot rolled over the top of his climb and dropped behind them. In the space of a heartbeat, the hunters became exposed targets. He fired a short burst into the trailing Zero. The rounds tore through the fighter's tail, severing its control surfaces. The aircraft tumbled end over end before vanishing into the cloud below. He did not linger for the second. Ammunition was critically low, and the remaining bombers were breaking away from their flight path, losing altitude and cohesion. He circled back upward one final time, scanning for the most critical threat, the bomber closest to American positions. It flew alone now, struggling to maintain altitude. The pilot dove quickly, conserving his last rounds for a precise attack. He aimed for the cockpit, fired a controlled burst, and saw the bomber shudder as the windshield shattered. Its descent was immediate and unstoppable. 8. By now, the sky had transformed into a wasteland of smoke trails, falling debris, and scattered aircraft. The once confident Japanese formation had been shredded. The surviving Zeros broke away, abandoning the mission, choosing escape over futile combat. And as the pilot leveled off, breath steady and engine humming, the morning sky, the same sky the Japanese believed they controlled, fell quiet. The Wildcat rose steadily through the clearing air, its wings scarred but intact, its pilot unshaken. The battle was over. What remained was the aftermath, numbers, consequences, and the irreversible shift this fight would bring to both sides. The sky over the Solomons gradually settled into silence, broken only by the distant rumble of surf along the island's jungle-lined coast. Smoke trails drifted downward in slow spirals, vanishing as they met the humid air. The Marine pilot steadied his Wildcat, taking a measured breath as adrenaline ebbed from his system. What remained was exhaustion, deep, bone-heavy fatigue familiar to anyone who had survived a prolonged engagement. Yet beneath it lay something else, the unmistakable recognition that he had just altered the course of a battle far larger than himself. Below, the scattered wreckage of 8 Japanese bombers marked a clear truth. The strike force, once confident and cohesive, had been broken apart with precision, speed, and tactical discipline. Only a handful of enemy aircraft, those that fled when the escort formation collapsed, would return to their base. The others had been claimed by the sea or reduced to fragments drifting across the canopy. When the pilot lowered his landing gear and guided the Wildcat toward the airstrip, the ground crews were already waiting. Marines rushed forward as the aircraft touched down, cheering before the propeller had even stopped spinning. Mechanics reached for the wings, taking stock of bullet holes, scorched panels, and splintered rivets. They counted impacts that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Yet the Wildcat had brought its pilot home, proving once again why the rugged machine was far from obsolete. Inside the operations hut, officers recorded the results with a mixture of astonishment and quiet professionalism. Radar operators confirmed the size of the incoming strike, 12 bombers, multiple fighters, and a clear intent to cripple the American position. Intelligence officers cross-checked reports from observers and estimated the surviving enemy aircraft. Their calculations told a stark story: more than half of the attacking force had been eliminated by a single pilot in a single sortie. Such numbers carried weight. They spread rapidly across the airstrip, moving from squadron tent to maintenance pit to the mess hut where Marines gathered between duties. By midday, even the most senior officers acknowledged that the event would redefine how American pilots viewed their own capabilities. The Wildcat, long dismissed as outdated, had demonstrated the strengths its designers built into it: resilience, firepower, and the ability to exploit altitude and speed against more agile opponents. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was equally significant. The assumption that American fighters were sluggish, predictable targets had shaped their escort tactics for months. Now, reports from the surviving Zeros described a different reality: a Wildcat attacking from above, striking with surgical precision, and shattering the bomber formation before they could react. The confidence that once defined Japanese aerial doctrine began to erode, replaced by a growing awareness that the Americans were adapting, quickly and aggressively. In the days that followed, Japanese commanders reviewed the failed operation with increasing urgency. They analyzed flight paths, escort patterns, and the vulnerability of their bomber groups to diving attacks. Some insisted the event was an anomaly, others recognized it as a warning sign that American pilots were gaining skill and that the Zero's limitations, long hidden beneath its early successes, were becoming exposed. Yet no matter how they framed it, the truth remained: a single Marine pilot had turned an entire mission into a costly defeat. For the Americans, the aftermath brought renewed confidence. The pilot's success was not treated as a legend or an exaggeration; it was documented fact, grounded in verifiable losses and confirmed radar signatures. It reminded the men stationed across the Pacific that the fight was far from hopeless, and that with discipline, training, and the right tactics, even an outdated aircraft could dominate a battlefield. As the sun set that evening, the pilot walked the length of the airstrip, passing the Wildcat that had carried him through the storm. The machine sat in the fading light, scarred but steadfast, its metal bearing the marks of a battle that had pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. He paused, resting a hand on its patched fuselage, understanding that the day's events were more than a personal victory. They were a turning point in a larger conflict, a moment when underestimated strength revealed itself with unmistakable clarity. The Pacific War would continue, demanding sacrifice and endurance from everyone involved. But for that one morning, high above the Solomon Islands, a single American pilot transformed the impossible into the undeniable. His actions echoed far beyond the crash sites scattered across the ocean, reshaping perceptions, inspiring his comrades, and proving that dominance in war often belongs not to the fastest or the most admired machine, but to the one flown with knowledge, resolve, and unwavering courage. And as night descended over the jungle and the airstrip fell quiet, the truth settled firmly into history. This was the day the outdated Wildcat proved just how wrong its doubters had been.